great to see everybody here after 2 years of lockdown and COVID. It's nice to be able to get to see old friends and colleagues again.
Firstly, we are working our way.
That's another sort of energy sustainable technology that sort of is great but works against us. It also burns the grass in my yard.
Good morning, everybody. It's Phil Murphy, and I'm Stuart Hodkinson, and Andy Turner's not here, but he sends his best wishes. So today we're going to talk to you about some research we did a year ago. It was looking at official fire incident data for England, and we wanted to explore it really to see what kind of risks we could see in the data, what kind of stories there were in that data about the safety risks and implications of high-rise and purpose-built blocks of flats. It was funded by Research England as a kind of impact fund. It took place at the University of Leeds, and Stretford House is on the front of the slide for a particular reason, isn't it, Phil?
It is, yeah. I used to live in that block.
So Phil's got some quite good personal experience of what we're talking about as well. We're not going to go through all this. We did try to find even less flattering photos of ourselves, but we couldn't. These are the worst ones we've got. Just a note about myself, I've been researching housing regeneration policies and experiences of residents for like 15 odd years, and I just recently wrote a book called Safe as Houses, which wasn't about fire safety initially, but obviously lots of things started to cross over into what happened at Grenfell. Phil's got a lot more expertise in lots of different aspects of fire, so I'll let him introduce himself.
And good morning, everybody. My name is Phil Murphy. Many years ago, I was a firefighter at a station called Moss Side in Greater Manchester. At the turn of the century, it was the busiest fire station in the country, and the station area was characterised by medium and high-rise flats. At the time that I joined the fire brigade there, I lived in a high-rise flat. I've lived in two since. Two of them have been single staircase buildings. I've spent over a decade of my life working with commercial partners, managing the risks in tall and complex buildings of all use types. And in addition to that, I bring together those three aspects, really. The ability to manage the fire safety in a tall and complex building well, having lived in a tall building for over a decade of my life, and having fought fires in many tall buildings as well. Thank you.
So what we're going to talk about today, first we're going to put the research findings in a bit of context. So we're going to sort of remind ourselves about what the kind of main high-rise safety debate is after Grenfell. Also talk about what those particular fire safety risks are of high-rise and purpose-built blocks. And then we're going to talk about research aims, findings, and what we did. If anyone wants a copy of the much longer research paper that's behind this presentation, you can download a copy. There's a link there. It's very small. You might not be able to see it, but I'm sure this presentation will be passed around afterwards. But come to us if you want the link, and we can give it to you. So after Grenfell, that whole debate around high-rise fire safety re-emerged in quite a devastating way. I think it was really about the safety of people staying put in a block of flats when there's a fire. Pre-Grenfell, the regulatory environment effectively stated and encouraged stay put as really the main or the default evacuation strategy. It was in the only real guidance for managing purpose-built blocks. The idea that stay put is fine in general because those buildings are built with compartmentation. And importantly, if we looked at official statistics, we wouldn't really see anything that would be concerning us because the number of fires were falling, the number of fatalities were falling. There was no alarm bells in that data. And that perspective that stay put was safe, that high rise is not really any higher risk, was embedded in that only government legal guidance which came out in 2011, the so-called LGA guide. And we just sort of wanted to capture, the nature of that perspective through this quotation or this extract. High rise does not equal high risk. No evidence from fire statistics exists to suggest that those living in purpose-built blocks are at greater danger from fire. Once a fire occurs, the likelihood of a death is actually less than the likelihood of a death when fire occurs in a bungalow or a house. So the risk is primarily about the likelihood of occurring and whether smoke alarms are installed, rather than the type of the dwelling, the height of the dwelling, or the architectural design of the building. I think what came out with Grenfell and what's come out in the public inquiry, what consistently comes out in the public inquiry, is that this was kind of this actual phrase has been used, a show me the body's perspective that was underpinning any questioning of the idea that stay put should be questioned. And that was kind of underplaying what Jill Koenig's called the low probability, high consequence type of events like Grenfell and like other major fires that we've seen around the world. They don't happen often, but when they do, they can be devastating. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to actually look at this official statistics. We wanted to go into them, not just take at face value someone saying they showed it. We wanted to actually go and look as far back as we could and get into the detail of that data and actually ask, what can it tell us? What can't it tell us? What could it tell us? And in general, we think on our reading of it, and it's by no means, we're not saying this is like the final story. Anyone can look at our methodology, can potentially pull it apart and say we've done things wrong. That's fine, that's part of an ongoing conversation, we're happy with that. We see increased risks in that data by type and height of dwelling. We don't see a reduction, we see things that really were already there prior to Grenfell that should be setting off some alarm bells. Phil, you're going to talk about high-rise living risks.
To set the context, really in terms of the difference in buildings between a regular dwelling and a high-rise dwelling, some of the most obvious ones really are quite plain to see. In your average semi-detached house, for example, you're looking at a building that has got 6 potential exit routes, which are very close to fresh air, and also 6 potential ways in that firefighters can use to get to a fire more quickly. Something that I heard frequently yesterday, and that we'll hear again and again, is that the speed with which water can be applied to the fire is absolutely crucial and is significant in terms of what the outcomes will be of that fire, in terms of the potential for injuries and fatalities. So within that superstructure, the tall building that contains the dwellings are a multitude of possibilities that relate to the spread of fire and smoke that do not exist in a dwelling that is on the ground. As part of a larger superstructure, a person in a dwelling is unlikely to be able to use a window. The fire service are unlikely to be able to use a window as a means of access. That person then has a single escape route to their own front door. They have a single route, invariably, in the majority of cases, to a single staircase, and then they've got a considerable distance before they finally then reach the safety of fresh air. Now, throughout these routes and throughout these parts of the buildings and the common areas are opportunities for smoke to spread and impede the escape of people by making the environment less breathable, less tenable, and making it more difficult to see as an evacuee makes their way through these areas. Thank you. Cheers. This is a reference to a fantastic piece of research which came about when an organisation in the Netherlands we're hearing increasing numbers of stories from frontline firefighters that fires that they were attending in multi-occupied buildings were producing large amounts of smoke that were hampering the firefighting effort. The levels of smoke proliferation that they were seeing was much higher than we've traditionally seen in fire service tactics. This is thought to be down to the number of plastics that we now see in the household environment and the number of products that we use that are plastic based that produce more smoke and more toxic smoke. And they wanted to investigate that, so they did it in a compartmented building, and they set fire to a suite, a settee within that building 20 times and measured a great number of aspects of the smoke spread and whether it affected the tenability, breathability and visibility on the exit routes of occupants in the building. In all tests, smoke propagated outside the fire room through several horizontal and vertical routes and subroutes. This involved both horizontal and vertical smoke propagation to different rooms in the residential building. This means that if only part of a sofa is burning in one room, high-risk situations will occur in several locations in the residential building. An important point to note here is that the smoke is not always visible. Carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide are produced in quantities that are lethal by an average sofa fire. So when we say to people, wait until you see the smoke, we're not protecting them from these gases that separate themselves from smoke and form pockets in unexpected places around a building, on floors above, below the fire, and particularly on escape routes. Now, one of the aspects of the research that I started to focus on when we were doing it was the time gap. And that's, there's a lot of attention. A few years ago there was a survey done, and the majority of the British public said that one of the most important aspects of their fire services work is the attendance time. And since then we've seen on a regular basis updates from the Home Office and from various fire brigades around the country in relation to the improvements in their attendance time. In terms of the attendance, most people, of course, that live in a house, the fire engine turns up outside the house, the firefighter grabs the hose reel and squirts water on the fire. That happens very quickly and very efficiently. That attendance time that we publish is almost irrelevant to people that live in flats, because it doesn't represent the time at which an intervention takes place. I was discussing this briefly with an esteemed colleague of mine in Toronto, Brent Brooks, somebody that you'll be hearing later today, and he sent me this slide. I'll put some commentary in there on the left, but at the mention of this time gap between the attendance time and the time at which a positive intervention takes place, Brent sent me that slide. That's the slide that I was working on when I received it, which alludes to precisely the same factors. A guy called Steve Sieber, a chief fire officer in Hertfordshire, where they had a firefighter fatality in a high-rise incident some years ago, carried out some experiments. And he found that it took his crews 20 minutes after they'd arrived to set up a bridgehead for a safe firefight in one of the apartments. Bearing in mind now also, these buildings don't have alarm systems. That directly impacts the speed with which water can be applied to a fire further down the line. So there's likely to be a slower reaction than if there were an alarm, and then there's going to be an extended time of preparations, partially brought about by the extensive arrangements that have been made for firefighters or their operational procedures in which they have to set up their bridgehead 2 floors below the fire, and which then of course would involve breaching the fire protection on the stairway and opening up a channel for fire and smoke to travel directly from the fire compartment out of the door of the apartment, because it's propped open by a hose, and then through the door onto the staircase, because that too is propped open by a hose. It takes considerable time to set up for a safe firefight, and that directly impacts the size of that fire and the ferocity of the fire when an entry into the apartment is eventually made. And this makes reference to a 2012 publication by the Department for Community and Local Government. They published quite a lengthy document which looked at fatalities and injuries, not only in fire situations, but also in special service corps, particularly fire accidents. And as you can see from that slide there, the likelihood of being seriously injured or dying in a fire grows. That's the blue line. And with the passage of time and without an intervention, the likelihood that somebody will suffer the consequences of a fire increase, and the likelihood that they will be rescued or escape safely decreases. And at the 20-minute point, those timelines intersect. So after 20 minutes, anybody in the same compartment as a fire, the likelihood of them dying is outweighs the likelihood of them being successfully rescued. This document, GRA 3.2, some of you may be familiar with it, particularly any operational personnel. The generic risk assessment for high-rise firefighting, which has now been withdrawn, I have to say, and it attracted a fair bit of attention at the Grenfell inquiry. Fire and smoke spread can develop internally by breaching compartments, travelling along shafts, ducting externally when fire breaks out of windows and through failed wall panels. This can lead to rapid spread to other compartments and floors due to the effects of thermals, movement of hot gases, and wind speed and pressures. Now, we know all this. We know these risks are there. We know these things happen. We know that a shared superstructure is going to contain the poisonous products of combustion that will inevitably emanate from a fire and inevitably enter the escape routes of that other occupants are intended to use. The time gap that it takes to reach a place where there's a fire and apply water, or to get to a casualty, is absolutely fundamental to the outcome for casualties over at any incident, really. But certainly we can see that in the data when we analyse it en masse.
So we wanted to just cover all of those. There's many more, but we wanted to identify and remind everyone of those high-rise fire safety risks, just because when you've got official guidance downplaying risks, and then when you actually think, hang on a minute, there's a very reason for having a tall buildings fire safety conference session in the whole first place. You know, there is something specific about tall buildings and also purpose-built blocks. So we wanted to put those in everyone's minds while we start to then explain what we're doing with our research. So we just initially wanted to explore, you know, those kind of statements around, is it safer, or is it just as safe in a high-rise or a purpose-built block than if you're in a house or a bungalow fire? But then when we actually started to think about the data, we got hold of the data and we started to ask other questions. So first of all, the data is incident level data. Every fire incident attended by fire rescue services in England, using the incident reporting system that was set up in 2009. I went live in 2009, so it's managed by the Home Office, and every time there's a fire and the fire service attend, they will answer 160 questions about that fire as soon as possible after the incident, and it'll be logged in this database system. And then obviously over time the Home Office will produce official statistics from it and reports. And when we started to look at the number of questions that were asked and look at the number of fields that are actually published, you know, there's only about 24 or only about 40 odd fields that make it into the incident level data that's published every year, and yet there's 160 questions. So we asked the Home Office, could we have all 160 questions or fields, and they obviously said no. But we managed to get 24 additional fields, which we could do without entering some complicated data sharing agreement, which would have delayed what we were trying to do. That compromised the research in different ways, which we explained in the report. But what it did do is it gave us a real insight into the additional information and evidence that the Home Office is really sitting on that could be used to look at, to identify patterns and risks and maybe even prevention around them in the future. We looked at 302,000 dwelling fires. We've got a data set of 302,000 dwelling fires. Just to be clear, that excludes hostels, hotels, B&Bs, nursing care homes and student halls. We also have that data, but they're not comparable because some fields are different to others. So we just went with what we could actually compare over time. It produces 19.6 million individual pieces of data about those fires. Sounds a lot, and it is a lot. Andy, who's not here, is a computational scientist. He can handle that kind of data, so he writes some software and he can produce incredibly quick analysis of quite a complicated way. But in the end, we just focused on quite a lot of simple questions around relationships between certain things. Just to flag up what those fields are. So what's published is on the left, and they'll cover things like which fire and rescue service it was, when did the fire take place, weekend or weekday, time of the year, cause of the fire, source of the ignition, response times, whether there was evacuations and rescues, and things like fire size on arrival and spread of fire, which are very important for what we're particularly looking at. So there's a lot of good information that's put out there.
Tall Building Fire Safety Network delivers high-quality safety management training for anyone involved in the fire risk management of high-rise or tall buildings. Recognised by the Institution of Fire Engineers, we've been delivering fire safety training since 2011, and many organisations rely on our training for gaining competence in this field. Sign up for our training courses and conferences in 2023.
The additional fields, however, allow us or enable us to explore how useful they could be for looking at those risks that we've just been talking about. So there's a field around compartmentation, which we found out isn't very useful, but it was still interesting to see it in there, that there was data being collected about whether compartmentation was effective, whether it was missing or not. There was information about means of escape, whether had it been adequate or not. Most importantly, we had height data. So normally, when we're looking at official statistics, we get effectively three building height categories, 1 to 3, 4 to 9, and 10 plus floors. But we were actually able to look at each incident for purpose-built blocks, the actual height of the building, and where the fire originated on, which was actually very, very useful for us to look at. We also got extra detailed information about how big the fire was on arrival, and also things around why, the reasons for any delays to firefighting, which again we thought were really interesting to explore. So what did we do? Well, we did a lot of quantitative analysis, obviously. It's a fairly well-structured data set, a lot of numbers, a lot of yes-no answers in there, a lot of drop-down boxes that firefighters will click on. So it's a good data set for analysing. We then tried to cross-tabulate and correlate between different variables to see if there were any potential relationships or associations between them. We were particularly trying to create rates of fire, rates of fatality or casualty by the number of fires, by the number of different types of buildings, and then look at outcomes that we could see in the data. One of the important things to flag up is that we don't know how many people might have died or injured in the fires that we were looking at. We only know that there was a fatality or a casualty, and that's a limitation to our analysis. But we have other published data that we could draw in, which we used to do some of the statistics that we produced. The key thing that we found, which is controversial, and we maybe did something controversial as well, is that there were some big inconsistencies in the data sets between what the firefighters were recording as the building height in terms of putting it in the category of 1 to 3 floors, 4 to 9 floors, or 10 floors plus for purpose-built blocks, and what they were then entering in terms of the height of the building, the floor height, and the floor that the fire began on. In about 8% of fires in the purpose-built blocks, there was just a contradiction between the fields. And I had a back and forth with the Home Office statistics team about this, and I suggested that, is it not more plausible that firefighters might have ticked the wrong height category box rather than put information about where the fire began or the building height wrong twice, and they suggested that was a plausible interpretation. So we decided to reclassify all those fires and see what it looked like and what it showed. There was also this other anomaly in the data, which was that in the data set, there cannot be a floor 0. It's very clear that ground floor is 1 and below ground floor is -1, and that's what firefighters are instructed to input. And yet we found in many fires there were zeros against floor height, which again we didn't quite know what to do with, but it could make a material difference to the analysis. So we reclassified those fires as well. When it was a 0, we put it as a 1. So we did that, we're happy to stand by that, and we're also happy to change the analysis and do something different. Everything's in the report if you want to read what we did. This is just to flag up the different dwelling types that are recorded in the system. Those are the things that we were comparing. So, just very briefly, I think we've still got a good amount of time. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah, great. Okay. So in terms of the official narrative, and that's represented in this, we might see this graph quite often. The official narrative of falling fires, for us, it masks what we saw as increases in fires with certain heights of purpose-built blocks. So when we reclassified the fires, we found actually that medium-rise fires had increased by around 12.5% over the decade that we were looking at the data. So 10 years of data, they'd actually increased over that time. Probably due to the fact that there's been a big explosion of medium-rise stock compared to the low-rise and high-rise. That could be one plausible explanation. But it's an unsettling statistic when we see, we don't need to worry about fires and purpose-built blocks because they're just going down all the time. Actually, some height categories are going up. And specific building height categories are going up in quite pronounced ways. So, building heights, all buildings that were 5 floors high over those 10 years, they exhibited a 35.4% increase in fires over the decade. Buildings of 11 floors high, 38.2% increase over the decade. We don't know what that means. It just means that it isn't going down, all like the graphs show. It's also going up. And if there's variability, then that really should shake us out a little bit of the complacency that risk is falling, when actually in some buildings risks could be rising. We then address the specific issue of, are high-rise residents really as safe in the event of a fire as those living in houses or bungalows? The first thing to say is that when you compare purpose-built high-rise with bungalows, you see a very similar story. And we thought, why are bungalows so deadly? Why do this have such extreme sort of outcomes when intuitively they might be the safest, we were thinking, to get out? So we looked at who lives in a bungalow and who lives in a house and who lives in a purpose-built block of flats, looking at English Housing Survey data. And 71% of bungalow dwellers are aged 65 or over, whereas only 28% of house dwellers and 22% of flat dwellers are aged 65 and over. So straight away, that's telling us that bungalows are outliers in this debate. We should be comparing purpose-built with houses. The majority of the stock, the majority of the population live in houses. That should be the safety measure that we're comparing. So when you compare purpose-built high-rise with houses, you get quite a different story. You don't get as safe. You get a doubling of risk of fatality in a high-rise block of flats fire than you do in a house fire. You also get much greater increase in risk of non-fatal casualties requiring hospitalisation, and severe non-fatal casualties requiring hospitalisation. So our analysis is quite different to the kind of confidence around the safety of high-rise that was in official guidance. And it's been sitting there, last 10, 11 years for everyone to see. Number 3, third finding is around just this proportionality. Again, the idea that high-rise residents shouldn't worry about fires because the statistics say they shouldn't. Well, when you normalise the number of fires by the population living in those different types of buildings, again, you start to see how frequently a high-rise resident will experience a fire in their building. And this is the important distinction. Not in a dwelling, in the building. So they're living in a building, their dwelling may never experience a fire, but they will experience a fire in the building they live in, and that is what the whole first presentation was really about, wasn't it? About what you do in that scenario. So 1.9% of the English housing stock across the decade produced, 4.5% of the fires, whereas something like nearly 80% of bungalow and house stock of the proportion of the English housing stock produced just over 60% of the fires. So clearly, if you're living in a block of flats, you're more likely to experience a fire than if you're living in a house or a bungalow, and that is significant when we're talking about the greater risks of fire. Bill, sorry, not Bill. Phil.
This slide broadens really the examination of the risks that that might be associated with somebody that's living in a block of flats, and compared to houses, and some of the differentials that exist there. 37% of high-rise fires start outside. There are often a series of buildings associated with a block of flats. You might have garages underneath, you might have independent storage units for residents underneath, you've got your common areas, you've got your refuse rooms, and invariably a series of other rooms or buildings associated with the management of the block as well. 16.5% arson in blocks of flats compared to 9.9% in houses. And of course, when that happens in a communal area in a block of flats, then you're looking at the escape room being impacted in a fashion that you wouldn't expect to see in a ground floor dwelling house. 41% of purpose-built flat fires started outside of a dwelling were deliberate, compared to 26.4% of houses. We know that security is a serious fire safety issue. I'm not sure if landlords treat that access aspect with as much importance as well as people that live in the block would desire, really, when the security isn't right at the entrance to a block. It's not just a security issue for the people that live there. It's a fire safety issue for the people that live there. And it's a fire safety issue for all of the people in the building. This isn't about one dwelling. This is about hundreds of people in the building that become more vulnerable when a landlord will not repair the main entrance to the building. Unfortunately, we've seen quite a recent example where a lady and her child died just inside the front floor, the main entrance, getting out of a block of flats where there was a fire. And that's because the electronic lock stayed locked. And she died just inside that door, in the smoke, on the floor, with one of her children, and her other child that was with her is going to be in hospital for a long, long time. Something as simple as the main entrance door in a block of flats is very, very important to the fire safety and the security of the individuals that live there. But it brings with it a whole host of other fire safety issues related to areas outside of an actual dwelling, but that can impact that building in serious ways. The very layout of blocks of flats, really, and the nature of the fires that you get in them lead, unsurprisingly, to there being more delays. Anybody that's worked operationally for any period of time in a station area where there are flats, as well as telling you that it takes longer to put water on a fire in a flat because it's up in the air, they will tell you that things go wrong more frequently. There are more activities, there are more tasks, and more things will go wrong and happen that delay further the application of water to the fire. Now, the indications around delays could be better, and I think that's demonstrated in this example here, where The main reasons of delays during a fire incident, as you can see, some of them, such as the fire location not immediately evident and sent to the wrong location, they're lower for a block of flats. Whereas logically, looking back on past incidents, you would suspect that would be higher. My personal suspicion is that some of those are being mislabeled under the building type. And as you can see, the tick box, which put delays at incidents down to the building type, existed in 61.8% of delay cases when it came to high-rise buildings. Now, the sharp-eyed operational people out there will also note what delay isn't on that list, and that's water. And that's something that we know occurs with some frequency at incidents are water supply issues. So I suspect that also they are labelled in as being down to the building type. Notable also in the percent of fires that have delays to firefighting, and in buildings of 10 stories plus, it's 1/5. 20% of them experience a delay to firefighting. And as covered previously, any delay has a direct impact on the outcome of the number of people that get injured or fatalities.
Okay, we've not got long left, so I'm going to try to do this very quickly. We were looking for fire spread indicators or information in the data sets, where we were actually saying, can the data tell us about fire spread? It can't tell us very much about compartmentation failure because it's not capturing that data, but we could potentially see unusual fire spread as a flag or an indicator of compartmentation failure. So what we did was we thought about how would we use the data to show that. And what we did was we basically said, if by the time the fire and rescue service had arrived on the scene, a fire had spread beyond the item first ignited, beyond the room of origin or floor of origin to either 2 floors, more than 2 floors, or the whole building, or in other ways that we can capture, then we would mark that as potentially unusual and significant fire spread. So if it's spread like that before the fire brigade arrived, then potentially that's an indicator of compartmentation failure. So when we did that as well by the fire end and looked and compared the statistics, and so what we found was that something like 2.3% of purpose-built fires potentially involve this significant unusual fire spread, which is every 2 days on average over the decade. When you then looked at the outcomes, was there a fatality or a casualty, 29.6% of fires that had unusual and significant fire spread involved a fatality or casualty compared to 15.5% for those for all purpose-built fires. So there's potentially information in there that we can use to suggest that something went wrong with the building. But this is like a potential. And it's one of those things where the data could be much more useful than it is if it was set up to capture information about buildings and not just what happened in relation to firefighting. And then finally, we wanted to look at relationships between height and risk to life. And again, this is complicated. I haven't got time to really go into a lot of the detail. But at some point, basically from the 6th floor upwards, we started to see fires that were more likely to have a fatality or casualty than those originating below the 6th floor. And that there were 113 combinations of building height and floor of fire origin that pose an increased risk to life than what house fires pose in terms of risk. So, to conclude, I suppose the main conclusion for us is that the overall trends and averages that get presented in official fire statistics can mask and hide increased risks for specific buildings of specific heights, of specific even architectural designs, which are either clearly present or potentially present in the very data that is said to suggest otherwise. That we do think that risk increases with height. We don't just that mean in terms of like the higher up you go, the greater the risk. We mean that high rise in all of the risks we've identified at the start of the talk, and then looking for particular indicators in the data, we can see definite relationships that suggest higher risk. And again, for us, the data suggests we should, be precautionary in how we do regulation and practice. and not assume that compartmentation and everything else is going to be fine on the night or on the day, because as we know, that can lead to catastrophe. Phil, you wanted to mention those last two bits?
Yeah. I put fire risk assessors there, but it should also applies to building managers, landlords, people involved in the management of tall residential buildings. Really, all of them need to be more aware and learn from past investigations that followed previous fires. A more in-depth knowledge is required. We've got thousands of buildings that have no sprinklers, they've got no extinguishers, they've got a single staircase, and they've got no fire alarms. We've got some people, I'm afraid, are going around fire risk assessing that, and they don't really know much about fires in tall buildings at all. They've been given a simple guide that tells them not to check whether fire alarms are working if they are present, not to check whether sprinkler systems, they're not verifying any of it. And they don't know anything about the history of fires, they don't know what's gone wrong at any of the fires, and they've got no idea what might go wrong at the next fire. So that doesn't leave us in a good situation where we're getting quality fire risk assessments. For the last 10 years, the vast majority of fire risk assessments done on tall residential buildings have been absolutely bobbins, I'm afraid. They have not been up to standard at all, and we need to change that. And one of the ways in which we can change that is by increasing the knowledge that people have of fires that have occurred in the past and precisely what's gone well and what hasn't gone well at those fires. And finally, the incident reporting system, it could be improved so much. I think one area of the fire safety sector that's really suffered in the last decade or two is prevention. I put the question to somebody the other day. I mean, we're still banging on with the same messages, generic national messages about smoking, about cooking, about smoke alarms, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But within that data, there are specific messages about specific building types and things that are happening. And if all we do is say, well, fires are gonna happen and nobody died, that gets us nowhere. There are messages within that data, important messages. There are near misses. There are trends occurring. There are warning signs. And if we don't look at the detail and heed those warning signs, then it'll come back and bite us. Thank you very much.